Okay, I guess I'll get started here today as we kind of head down it's our last week of original material, right? And so I'm going to try a daring maneuver today, which is to get through selected parts of 2 slide decks in one lecture. So we'll see how it goes, and yeah, I guess we're at that point where I'm trying to cover a lot of stuff, and I can't do everything, right? Pursuant to that, I do have your Top Hat site now should be completely fleshed out with readings and all of that. So, I mean, you can maybe see here in terms of readings, I now have basically, let's see how this goes here, chapters 18, 19, and 20. I put up chapter 20, even though that'll be kind of for tomorrow or for next class. And there's also 2 new homeworks on there. I just put both of them up. I was going to kind of stagger them a little bit, but I said, you know what, I'll just put it all up now. Right, so you can take a hack at that stuff. And just to remind you what the schedule looks like down the stretch here, our last class, I guess, of original material is Thursday, right? And then next week we just have basically a week from today we have our review class, right? And then the exam is Thursday. So it all happens pretty quickly here in these next 2 weeks. Luckily for the final, it's a little bit later. It starts at 9 o'clock here, right? You have 2 hours, so it goes from 9 to 11. But I'm not really going to change anything about how it works, right? So it'll be exactly the same format, about the same length, all of that stuff. We'll do everything. Like I think I said it last time, there's no point in spending time and effort establishing your ideas about what to expect and then changing it all at the last, at the very end. So we'll stick to the usual routine for that stuff. I'm going to just dive right in because, as I said, I'm going to try to cover 2 things. Last time we talked about growth, right, which is maybe the biggest economic question. And we saw that, it seems like there's sort of 2 periods, at least economically, and it's a little bit of a simplification, but we have sort of the Malthusian days, and then we have the post-Malthusian days, which started around 1770, I guess, where the world started growing, right, or GDP per capita started growing at more or less 2 or 3% per year. Not everywhere, but in some parts of the world. And then over time, the rest of the world has been catching up. Lifespans have been going up. People have been getting healthier. Population has been growing at the same time. All of these things have been going on, and why this happens is really a big question. Now, one interesting thing I wanted to talk about that I didn't get to say last time is that there is this issue about the distributional aspects of growth, and that not everybody gains in the same way when there's growth. So we talked about rich people last time. This is a really neat graph, which is a way of talking about the world distribution of income and how it's changed over the years. So Branko Milanovic did this, and he's actually a faculty member at the Graduate Center. And it's a pretty neat graph. So what he did was he basically took everybody in the world and ordered them by income. So you have the poorest people down here and the richest people up here, right? Took them all in about 1988. And then he said, if we take these people and think about what happens to their income over the next, 30 years, right? This chart kind of tells you where the gains to growth have really occurred over at least the past 30 years. So you can see here what this is telling us is that if you were one of these, say, from between percentile 5 to, say, 65, you experienced almost a doubling of your income over a 30-year period, right? So this would be a lot of people in, I guess, Southeast Asia. That would be one of the places where a lot of this growth occurred. Eastern Europe would be another place. If you were up at the top of the distribution, maybe you didn't, or at kind of between 70 to 90, I'll say, you didn't experience quite as much economic or growth in your income. So that would be typically working class people in developed countries like the United States, right? But if you were some of the richest people in the world, you experienced kind of similar growth to everybody else. So this has been, there's been a lot of talk about inequality and growth and all of those things. And you know, a lot of people have sort of wondered if we should worry about this, that this is how the profile of growth has looked like, and it's kind of changed a little bit over the next 20 or so years. Should it worry you? I don't know. But we do have a class in inequality, and you can sort of think about these things a little bit more deeply. So I'm going to skip forward and just kind of move from growth. It really hurt me to skip those slides, but I had to do it. Move from this world where we talk about growth to talk about macroeconomics more explicitly. So what is macroeconomics? Well, you might think about it kind of as follows. So GDP grows over time, but it also fluctuates, right? So if you look at this graph here, this is the GDP in the United States from roughly, it's a little grainy, I wish it was, let me just see if I can make this bigger. Maybe this will help. A little bit, maybe. So you can see this is GDP growth or GDP over time in the United States, real GDP per capita, starting around 1880 and going to the present. And you can see there's that nice trend line. That's kind of what growth was all about. Well, you can also see that there's a lot of fluctuations around this trend line, right? So for example, this dark area here is the Great Depression, and you can see the actual real GDP per capita fell well below the trend line. And then in World War II, it went above. But over time, it goes below and above in, I don't know, sort of a random fashion. And you can see here that these typically correspond with some big economic events, right? And in fact, you can see they're kind of shaded here. There's the Vietnam War. Various wars, I guess, are shaded in the bottom. So as macroeconomists, this is really what we're worried about, these fluctuations around this long-term trend. And if I can back off of my slide here, what we want to know is how to mitigate, or what we want to think about is how we mitigate these fluctuations as a matter of policy. So what is the basic idea here, or I think I told you some time ago, what we were trying to do is think about the relationship between aggregate variables, and what we're going to want to do is inform our thinking about these fluctuations around that trend using well-described aggregates that we understand. So, in the interest of time, I'm kind of glossing over a lot of details here. What we're really sort of comparing are two growth rates, right? And I'm going to show you that to some degree, getting a good value for one is kind of incompatible with getting a good value for the other, right? That is to say, we have to choose what we want. What are these two things? Well, the growth rates that we care about in macro, or that we're going to try to bind together here, are inflation, right? Price level changes. We think about that as bad, right? We want to avoid inflation. Well, another growth rate, real GDP, that's good. We want that to be high, right? So we want one thing to be high, growth rate of real GDP. That means we're being productive. And another growth rate, inflation, to be low. And I'm going to show you that they typically vary together in a rather interesting and predictable, I don't know if I want to say that, but in some sort of regular fashion, and that we can use our theory as we put it into place already to understand this, right? So really our practical problem here is we're going to, and I know I'm getting ahead of myself here, is to try to keep the economy at capacity, that is to say growing nicely, close to keep it close to that trend line, but we don't want it to go over capacity, right? And we'll see that why don't we want that to happen? Well, that causes inflation, right? So we want to grow as fast as we can without overdoing it, if you want to think about it that way. So it turns out, thinking about growth rates is a little bit nuanced in terms of, it's just a little bit analytically difficult to think about growth rates. It's much easier to think about unemployment. Why is this? Well, unemployment is actually a very nice measure as to whether or not our economy is working at capacity, right? Put simply, when unemployment is low, right, that means we're fully using our resources across the economy. And unemployment, of course, is the fraction of people who are not working. So what we'd like to do is keep this as low as possible, as I'm going to show you in the next couple slides. So ultimately, macroeconomics, keep us near that trend line. That amounts to, in this quick overview anyways, trying to keep inflation down, but also trying to keep everybody fully employed. Then we'd be close to the trend. Okay, and I'm going to come back to that in a second and show you. I know I went quickly through that, but maybe just a quick little slide or two here on unemployment, which is what we're going to think about here. I'm going to relate it to GDP growth in a second, how it's calculated. So you can see that what you do, it's really pretty simple. You take the total population, right, and you kind of divide it into people not working, or people who aren't, sort of in the workforce or capable of being in the workforce. So that would be, people who are young, kids, senior citizens who are retired. We take our working age population, which is, typically people in the age range that I have there. And then we sort of split out everybody who isn't, sort of in the labor force, non-participants they're called here. Those are people who are students, who are in jail, long-term care, sick, whoever, people who just can't work for some other reason. And also people who choose not to work, right? So this could be people who do take care of children at home, say, right? Stay-at-home moms or dads. Everybody else is in the labor force, right? Those are people out there looking for jobs, basically. And of that labor force, some people are employed and some are not, right? And so typically what we do is we just take the ratio of the unemployed to the labor force, and that becomes our measure of unemployment. And maybe this graph will kind of suggest a little bit more about how it works. This is, if you look at 2016, this was the breakdown of the United States population. And you can kind of see that there are about, you go from 322 million to 252.9 million people of working age. A good chunk of those folks, 94.5 million, aren't in the labor force. So once again, that's typically stay-at-home dads and moms, or people who are sick or, for whatever other reason can't work, but are otherwise, Anyways, and then there's our labor force. 151 million out of about 158 million people were employed, 7.4 million were unemployed, and so out of this, there's a question, 1 second, we just sort of, 7.4 divided by 158.4 gives us the unemployment rate, right? It's really that simple. There's a question, yes, go ahead.
This is only for U.S. citizens, or does this include people who aren't citizens?
I don't think citizenship matters, right? So you know what, but I don't know. So I love those questions because that's yet another reason why you could, there's a research topic almost pops right out of that, And I think I slipped it past you here. The way we actually figure out what the unemployment rate is through the current population survey, which is done, I believe, at a statewide level. And essentially what happens is by survey they ask you, are you, some basic demographic information, and then they say, are you looking for work? Are you looking for more work? And you can say yes or no. Are you underemployed? Are you employed? And then the survey, they use those survey tools, statistical tools, to estimate the nationwide unemployment rate. It's a pretty fascinating thing, and it's really interesting to sort of think about these twists and turns that it might take. Right. Now, oftentimes what we do as economists is, you sort of have to be practical about these things. I said that what we would like to do is keep our economy close to its capacity, which would be like being on that trend line in the diagram I showed you. Well, there's capacity and there's practical capacity, right? And we usually distinguish between these different types of unemployment, pursuant to thinking about what is actually possible. So frictional unemployment, right? We have kind of 4 types here. Really 3 are the big ones we talk about most of the time. So Right. A lot of people are frictionally unemployed. Those are people who are graduating school, looking for jobs, people who, maybe just upped and moved to Arizona and now have to find a new job or something like that. And it just takes a little time, right? When your, life circumstances put you in a situation where you're looking for a job. So that's normal, just job market turnover. There's structural unemployment, which is pretty serious. This is when jobs are basically destroyed by technological change, right? So, people were worried about maybe structural unemployment coming our way because of AI or something, right? But this happens when, the personal computer came along. I was actually not too long ago watching that show Mad Men. I don't know, it's probably nobody watches that anymore. But it was set in the 50s. And in those days, it was kind of, it was about these advertising executives. Every executive kind of had their own secretary, right? Their own administrative assistant. Well, when computers came along, we kind of got rid of that model, right? And so there were many secretaries who were, I guess, structurally unemployed. Of course, usually what happens is the secretaries are now freed up to do something maybe more interesting or something else in the economy. And of course, my other example is automation in agriculture here. So for macro purposes, cyclical unemployment is what really worries us, right? This is when something happens in the economy and people are laid off just because there's lack of demand for their services, right? The economy goes bad and the automaker says to its employees, sorry, folks, we're going to have to lay off 12% of our workforce here just because nobody's buying cars, right? And these are the sorts of, these are the kinds of jobs that, when business activity goes down, people lose them. And we're trying to really prevent that as macroeconomists, right? People losing their jobs just because the economy is bad. So this is kind of what we mean by when we say practical unemployment is kind of what we're thinking about when we think about the economy as being at capacity, i.e. the economy kind of being on the growth path over time. So it occurs when all employment is either frictional or structural, right? There's going to be people, their lives evolve in a certain way. So there's going to be people looking for jobs for various reasons at various times. There's going to be some frictional unemployment. There's also going to be some structural unemployment, unfortunately, just because technological change occurs, right? Some things go out, of demand and new things come in. So we think about it when there's no cyclical unemployment, right? Nobody's losing their job because of the economy being bad, right? That's kind of what we're after, and that's what we're thinking about when we think about everybody is fully employed. So that's kind of our benchmark. That's really what we're after as economists. So we think about this in my fourth bullet point here. The natural rate of unemployment is kind of one side of this coin, right? We're at potential GDP. We're growing at a reasonable rate. Well, that also means that we're at this natural rate of unemployment. I'm going to show you this too in terms of our goal. So macroeconomics revisited. It's kind of a two-pronged goal here, and in its simplest way here. The idea is to keep unemployment at its natural rate, right? While also keeping inflation as low as possible, right? So that's kind of, if I had to, one sentence on what macroeconomics is about, I might say that might be how I would summarize it. So here's kind of a graph to convince you. I've kind of just said, oh, well, let's think about unemployment instead of growth, right? Or being fully employed here. This graph is maybe kind of the way I can ensure you that it's okay. So the top graph has our unemployment rate, right? Our bottom graph has the output gap. I'll tell you what that is in a second. One thing you can do from this graph, I know it's a little hard to see, is you can kind of calibrate your ideas about what a good unemployment rate is, right? And indeed, there's something to that in macroeconomics. So you can see this goes back to from 1980 to 2020. In 1982-83, the unemployment rate spiked up to something close to 11%. the economy really went in the tank there. Actually, down here, you can see what happened. GDP fell well below what its potential was like. I'm going to show you another aspect of this in a second. So you can think about GDP being way below its trend line at the same time unemployment was high. Well, GDP recovered, unemployment fell. You see the blue area there? Then unemployment went below its natural rate, and GDP was above, right? It was growing in some sense. We were working above capacity. And really the whole lesson of this graph is that the two things are very, very, very closely related, right? Unemployment high, output gap will be negative, right? Unemployment low, the output gap will be positive. So one thing you're probably thinking about, I'll just throw it out here, is I have two things to say about this. The first one is you're probably saying, well, why is it bad to be above capacity? I wish I could give 110%. Well, quick answer right now, we will see that it creates crazy pressure on prices and usually causes inflation. So just another thing, what is this output gap? If that was, might be a little mysterious, but I can kind of go back to this diagram here and just tell you that the output gap is the distance between these two lines. So for example, in 1980, that spike I showed you, you can see here how the darker line is well below the trend line. That's what we mean by there being an output gap, right? Basically that graph was the difference between the two lines. So where was I here? Okay. I was going to give you another look at unemployment. This is unemployment, just to once again calibrate your ideas about unemployment over time. This is from our beloved Fred website. And you can see that here I go back to, post-World War II. The blue line is the trend line, right? What you might think about as the natural rate of unemployment, or the rate at which our economy is humming along at capacity. The red line is actual unemployment, and you can see that it fluctuates quite a bit, and that we've had some rather prolonged spells of unemployment, and also some spikes. So there's 1980, those were some bad recessions there. That's indeed what these shaded bars are, recessions. You can see there's the housing market debacle in 2008, which led to a rather prolonged spell of unemployment being over its natural rate. Of course, 2020, there's the COVID, right? Kind of unlike anything we've ever seen before, honestly. Unemployment rate spiking to 15%, but then coming down pretty quickly. It's interesting, if the Great Depression were in here, maybe I have another picture here with the Great Depression. But you can really get the same idea. Yeah, okay, so here we have a longer span here. So on the top, I think I'm going back to 1900 or so, 1901 to 2021. So there's the unemployment profile. Once again, I'm just trying to historically calibrate your minds to what these numbers look like. So yes, in the Great Depression, unemployment spiked above 20%, right? So almost a quarter of people were unemployed. And so I kind of think about that. My kids are, high school students. They've been reading those books, the John Steinbeck, like Of Mice and Men and stuff like that. High school reading. And it's kind of funny when you sort of think about that against the backdrop of the Depression. You're like, why the hell are these guys just wandering around the countryside, Well, it makes a little bit more sense when you think about what was going on. Just, people were just out of work. Right? It was hard to find jobs. The Dust Bowl was happening. So there was this macroeconomic aspect there. So you can also see here that in World War II, unemployment was at an all-time low. And maybe that puts COVID in some perspective for you as well, what happened there. Okay, well, one of the other interesting things here is if your mind's eye can kind of just correlate these two things, once again, once you take econometrics and statistics, in our economics major, you'll think about the statistics of this in more detail. But you can see here that you can kind of see some relationship emerging between these two things. Unemployment on the top, we want to keep that low. Inflation on the bottom, we also want to keep that reasonable. And maybe you can see here that at certain times one thing spikes while the other thing falls. At other times, it seems like they're kind of moving together. So you look at the 70s, we have some recessions. It seems like we had both inflation and unemployment, right, during these recessions. That doesn't seem like the case during the Great Depression. I didn't line them up perfectly, but it looks like then we had kind of inflation corresponding with, deflation, prices actually falling, corresponding with the Great Depression. So what we want to do is just take these two variables. Hopefully I've motivated it for you why we might care about unemployment. Inflation's a little tougher, but suffice it to say we like to avoid it. People get very angry about inflation. We want to sort of think about how we might model these two things together. And I mentioned some other aggregates as well, such as interest rates. Maybe we can fold those into the discussion too, once we get this going. So slide deck 1, I powered through it. Now we should be back on schedule here for slide deck 2. And maybe to just kind of give you this by way of introducing this thing a little bit about what historical inflation looks like. This will give you a little empirical fact to think about. Over the last, I guess, half century or so, this is, inflation data, consumer prices in the United States. We know how it's calculated, by the way. And you can see there were some big spikes in the 70s. A recent spike, right? So once again, maybe this will give you some perspective. After COVID, we had inflation like we haven't seen in some time. But you can also see here on this graph, maybe most of the time, these recessions, right? Whenever there's a recession, it looks like prices are going down, right? That is to say, inflation is slowing. So you can see that in the early 80s. It's harder to, the mortgage, subprime mortgage thing there. Right. I was going to say one other thing. Oh, the other thing you might note is that inflation got a lot less wild in the United States in general after about 1984, right? Like this part of the graph. Up until COVID, anyway, was mellower than the previous period. Okay, so that's just a quick look at that. We already saw this graph that we're putting these two things together, and this graph. So now, if you want to look at this stuff on my slides, you can. And it's a history of macroeconomics, but I don't quite have time to dig into all of these things. But people have been thinking about macroeconomic performance for a long time and how we get the economy in general to move. People have thought about how the money supply works over time. I spend an enormous amount of time talking about this in my history of thought class. And it's it's really killing me. If you can look at my slides, you can watch the video there. There's a trigger warning, so that might get you to watch it. I believe it's Beavis and Butthead. I'll just leave it at that. I can't go there. I even had some stuff on the Wizard of Oz that I'm going to have to blow over. Right? Suffice it to say that people think that the Wizard of Oz bears a very, very strange resemblance to a monetary policy debate that was raging around the time the book was written, right? So I recently learned that two other movies people think about as The Wizard of Oz. I don't know if anybody's seen L.A. Confidential. One film critic I heard describing that as a modern adaptation of The Wizard of Oz. The other one is Apocalypse Now. Right? I don't know if anybody's seen that. Anybody? Okay. Oh wow, that's a crazy movie. So I could, if we had another week, I would love to talk about that stuff, but we're going to have to skip over it. Okay, so let's start model building here. Let's start figuring out how we might talk about all these things that make up the macroeconomy in a way that unifies some concepts and also can explain some of these empirical facts that we seem to have here, right? When there's a recession, it seems like prices go down, except for in the 70s when it seemed like prices went up at the same time unemployment was up. How do we explain that, right? And what can we say about the money supply and interest rates? How do we add all that in there? And so what we're going to do is we're going to do what we've done all semester as economists. We're going to disassemble the various pieces of this problem, make sure we understand the components, and then put them back together in a way that lets us think about these complex things here. So one thing we're going to do, and this is really the key to or a key to macroeconomics, is to think about there being two types of prices, right? And I'm going to call them prices and wages, right? Those are my stand-in, I guess, words for prices. I mean the stuff that you buy, right? Soda, coffee, whiteboards, all these things. Consumer products. They have some set of prices. Think about those prices as one thing, what consumers pay for products. Well, then there's also going to be wages. Wages, well, what are those? Or what distinguishes wages here? Those are what businesses pay for inputs, right? So if you think back a couple classes, we had the circular flow, and we had kind of product markets, and factor markets and goods markets. Wages are prices in factor markets. Prices are prices in goods markets. That's how we're going to talk about these things. And we're going to need to keep them separate for a reason that I'm going to show you here in a second. First of all, what we're going to do is we're going to think about wages as being fixed, income as being fixed, and we're going to then think about how consumers demand products, right? Or how much of things in general consumers can buy at higher or lower price levels. We're going to arrive at a picture sort of like this, and I'm going to say a lot about this picture because you'll notice I've snuck a couple of crazy things onto this diagram here, onto the axes in particular. So I've called this AD, it's aggregate demand, that's what it means, and it means demand for things in general. Our hypothesis here, or our starting point, is that on the vertical axis, the price of things in general for consumers is being captured. So the way I'd like you to think about this is our consumer price index, right? That's what's on this axis. Prices in general can be thought of the CPI or some general price index. And you'll see I've even gotten the values there, so it looks kind of like it's calibrated to 100. So prices. Horizontal axis we'll think about as real GDP. I guess that's okay. You can think about it as the amount of GDP people want to buy at different price levels, right? And so this is demand for things in the economy, fixing people's wages, incomes, right? But letting the price of output vary. The goods market prices vary. So hopefully that's okay, right? And you can say, okay, I got it, Baker. We have a giant Q on the horizontal axis and a giant P on the vertical axis. And I understand that P is for products that people buy, right? It doesn't include wages. You might wonder why I've been so careful to do this. Well, because if you have wages changing, that's the price of labor, that determines people's incomes, and then our demand curve is shifting all over the place, right? So you have to hold everything else constant, right, to get a nice graph here. So this is the one place where I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of this. And I'll have to leave it to your macroeconomics 201 class for you to think more about the details here. So macroeconomics historically began with John Maynard Keynes, right? You've probably heard people talk about Keynesian policies and Keynesian economics and all that stuff. He wrote his book, The General Theory, I'll just call it, Interest, Employment, and Money. I think I might have gotten those words in the wrong order. But what he was trying to do was explain why we had this Great Depression. What happened? What caused this enormous calamity to basically affect the world economy? And in his construction, he broke spending, aggregate demand, into these three components, C plus I plus G. So those are, in day 1 or day 2 of macro, you'll learn about these things. What are these things? Well, it's also kind of, it's actually a nice breakdown, not only because, we'll see it has some theoretical merit, but it also has like this way of reminding you that when we're talking about aggregate demand, it isn't just people here, right? But there is C, which is consumption by people. That's, those of us drinking soda at 9 a.m. in the morning, or coffee or whatever, buying whiteboards and computers and phones and all that stuff. Well, there's also investment by firms. Firms spend a lot of money on various sorts of products to build new things, right? That's investment expenditures. Well, then there's also G, right, which is government expenditures. C plus I plus G, right? Keynes broke things down in this particular way and said those things form aggregate demand, total expenditures in the economy. Why did he do this? Well, he did this because he was a fantastic economist, and he was like, I need a breakdown that lets me explain the Great Depression in the simplest possible way. He's going to say, I think the problem is insufficient aggregate demand. That is to say, aggregate demand cratered during the Great Depression, and this caused a calamity across the economy. And consumption, well, that's just a dependable, catch-all part of aggregate demand. Investment is where the problem started, right? The activities of firms, right? Buying and, making decisions about what they're going to buy and purchase and all that stuff. Why was that the problem? Well, that was a very logical thing to do if you're thinking about the Great Depression, because, well, what happened, we all know about the massive stock market collapse, right? Just prior to the Depression. And then after that, businesses the stock market ceased to function, businesses stopped spending money. It seemed like a very logical thing to do, to say that a collapse in investment caused this whole problem. And then he said, well, we can solve it by using this instrument we have, G, which is government spending. Right? So it's a very sensible thing to do in a useful way to think about how this works. So that's aggregate demand, right? Now, it turns out we also have, a counterpart in the macroeconomy called aggregate supply, and we draw this thing in kind of an interesting way. It's, it can't just be demand and supply. It's, something has to be a little bit different here. So typically we kind of draw it in the macro world as upward sloping, but maybe getting vertical at this point we call potential GDP. Aha. What is potential GDP? Well, there's a couple definitions there, right? That's where GDP growth is at its trend line, right? That is where unemployment is at its natural rate. That's when basically our resources are as fully employed as they practically can be, right? So we have this potential line. So that's a little bit different. When we're talking about supply in an individual market, right, you don't have to worry about that so much. But when you're talking about markets all across the entire economy, you have to worry, right? Because, you can't arbitrarily increase the production of the entire economy, right? Now, another thing you'll notice about this, same axis, right? Price level, same idea, right? I've calibrated it so you can think about it. My y-axis is sort of a consumer price index. Over here, we have real GDP again, so we've been careful to put our aggregate demand and aggregate supply in the same XY space, right? I'll remind you again, though, you can't let anything change but these two things. What that means is that the wages that I mentioned, right? Wages are held constant, right? So we're not allowing, we're saying, okay, prices in factor markets are fixed. All we're doing is thinking about the prices that firms get for their stuff that they sell to you and the price that you pay. So when prices are high in general, firms want to produce more of that stuff, right? Of course, when prices are high, as we saw with aggregate demand, you want to buy less of it. But lurking in the background are wages. Why do I do this? Go back to, day 3 of class, right? And we talked about supply curves in different markets and all that stuff. And then we said that things had to be held fixed. One of those things was the cost of inputs, right? i.e. wages. You can't have those things changing because the supply curve will shift all over the place. So we're fixing one set of prices and just thinking about this other price. And just to think about what this vertical line means, it means that as we near potential, more price higher prices isn't really going to give us anything, right? Okay, so this is really kind of where we're going. We can talk about why aggregate supply is exactly where it is, as we can with demand. There's things like population and technology and all that stuff. But I'm anxious to dive right in here to this. I'm actually doing pretty well on time, so that's good. And we put it together and we get this thing called a short-run macroeconomic equilibrium. Right? All these components together. And you know what? There's no great surprise here if you sort of understand my motivation for aggregate demand and aggregate supply. We think about these two things as interacting, aggregate supply and aggregate demand, interact to determine a level of GDP and a price level, right? And we would think about that as a short-run macroeconomic equilibrium. Why short-run? Well, because we have to sort of square this with the fact that, back from my previous slide deck, it looks like the economy, well, it fluctuates, but it stays kind of close to that trend line over time, right? So we want to square that fact in our discussion of all of this. Okay, so hopefully you're okay with this.
How do we solve something like this? If it comes up in the test, how do we work with it?
Okay, well, we'll worry about we'll look at the homework questions and all of that stuff. But we're not quite done fleshing out all the details here, right? And I have a lot of explaining to do as to how this becomes a macroeconomic model where we can understand fluctuations around potential. So, but suffice it to say that over time, these things can intersect at just about any particular point. And, there's all these things, and I'm going to describe how it works when we get there, that might influence aggregate demand. So we're going to see that different sorts of policies, tax cuts, more spending, stuff like that, can increase aggregate demand, right? Monetary policies such as lowering interest rates, things like that, will also increase aggregate demand, right? So there's policy stuff that can change aggregate demand, and there's also other things that can change aggregate demand. So one example I have here is expectations about the future. So when consumer confidence is really low, aggregate demand can sag, and that can cause it to shift back. But I'm going to reserve saying anything about all of this, and we're going to we'll do a little practice here because I got time. And I also, happy Thanksgiving. I also have some time to move into my next slide deck, which will show you how all of this works together. Good, doing great here. So just a little practice with this stuff. Here we have Q, but here we think about this as our GDP, real GDP, and we think about this as a price level for goods that you buy, a CPI, right? Now, we're drawing aggregate demand and aggregate supply, and this would be our description of a short-run macroeconomic equilibrium. So out of this, right, we get I'll call it P star and a Q star. It's often called Y, so Q is just easier to kind of see on a board, I think. Okay, so government policy. If we were to say increase government spending, well, we would think about that, since we can write this as C plus I plus G, right? We would find that would tend to increase aggregate demand, right, if G goes up. And you can see as a result, well, in this simple picture of things, that would tend to produce higher GDP, right, and a higher price level. By the way, if we wanted to relate this to unemployment, we would say that this means low unemployment, right? As we go this way, unemployment goes down. So the other thing you might, if you wanted to think about something else, such as a stock market crash or a subprime mortgage crisis, the way you would sort of do that on this diagram, you would say, all right, well, that would amount to a decrease in investment, right, or some sort of fall in investment, and that would produce aggregate demand falling, and you would expect that GDP would go down and prices would go down. So it'd be kind of like a recession, right? Low output, higher unemployment, and lower prices. Okay, one other thing we can do, just erase this with this diagram, is we can also think about stuff that might change aggregate supply. So a technological expansion, right? If businesses find something like AI comes along, right, and makes businesses in general more productive, hopefully, we would expect that this aggregate supply would shift out. That would increase output and decrease unemployment, and at the same time cause prices to fall, right? Deflation. So in that sense, those are it's kind of a good scenario there. Okay, basic stuff, right? Just shifting around demand and supply, but using some different words here. Let's make this a little bit more interesting, because I still haven't explained to you, maybe the most interesting thing about this is that apparently the economy kind of stays close to potential over time, right? And that's kind of what we've been describing here. So let's plop in this long-run economic, we're going to think about long-run as kind of working like this now. So what is going on in this particular diagram? Well, I'm going to draw this here and show you how we build in this idea that the economy has some overall capacity that we want it to be at, right? So, yes, we have our short run. Here's aggregate demand, here's aggregate supply. We have our short run equilibrium here. But what I'm saying is that we can also add in a completely vertical line here that we'll call long-run aggregate supply. So this is our way of squaring these two things, and I'm hopefully going to show you how it works in the next couple of slides here. In the short run, we imagine that aggregate demand and aggregate supply bounce around, right? So they could be I've drawn them so they just happen to be right at long-run aggregate supply. We would think about that as a good thing. But in the long run, right, aggregate demand and aggregate supply don't really matter. Really what drives our economic performance in the long run is just the capacity to produce stuff, right? So prices really don't matter in the long run, because really what does matter is just, things like our population, our technology, the machinery we have, right? In the long run, those things dictate what our economy can do, and you might sort of think about this vertical line as meaning that whatever the price level is, in the long run, we will be at this long run trend. And that's kind of like what was going on those diagrams, right? We had this trend line that just has this pretty dependable shape. Or if you want to think about it this way, we had a natural rate of unemployment that was just pretty much a horizontal line, a little bit of fluctuation. And it didn't really seem to bounce up and down with the daily or monthly, whatever, whims of the economy. So you can kind of think about it, like this, that wherever AS and AD cross, they typically are close to this long-run aggregate supply or potential line, if you want to think about it that way. And that's kind of what I'm showing you here on this graph over the last couple of decades, where the black line up there is the potential is the actual performance of the economy. The orange line is potential. So in our diagram here, the orange line coincides with this vertical line. whereas the actual, wherever AD and AS cross, that corresponds with the black line up there. And of course, I just have the output gap there on the bottom. Okay. So using this, we can imagine how an economist now pictures, like this is hopefully going forward, how you will think about recessions, right? What you want to do is you want to say, okay, well, what is a recession? What does an economist call a recession? An economist says a recession is a point where equilibrium occurs in the economy, right? In the immediate, I guess, short run. Equilibrium occurs, and this equilibrium is below potential, right? So if you look at this, I have aggregate demand and what I've called short-run aggregate supply there. They're intersecting at a price and an income that is below the potential line, right? So the economy has found itself there. That might be a point like one of those downward spikes on the upper diagram there. So you can imagine aggregate demand and aggregate supply are crossing at that 0 point there, and if you go up to the orange line, that would give you the gap here. So in fact, you could interpret this kind of that way. You could say this is the potential, this is the actual, and this horizontal gap here is like the vertical gap on the diagram I showed you before. Aggregate demand and aggregate supply are intersecting below. So why might this, by the way, you would say here that at this point there is unemployment, right? Higher than usual unemployment. So oftentimes you'll actually, in some of my graphs, once we get used to it, I'll flop this and it'll say, employment or something here as well. Okay, so that's a recession. Why might it happen? Well, there's a bunch of reasons. One reason might be, let's see, anything that would cause aggregate demand and aggregate supply to be lower than they otherwise should be, poor consumer expectations, an investment crisis, right, leading to low investment spending. That would shift aggregate demand back and might cause something like this. Of course, you could also get this by shifting supply back. What might do that? Well, a great example is some general rise in input costs, right, such as the price of oil just going up. It turns out to be an important input in just about everything. So if the price of energy goes up, that could cause supply to shift back, and we might be there. So this is great. I have, just enough time to kind of explain to you something I've slipped right past you, but maybe is puzzling you a little bit. And that is, why the hell would you ever expect AD and AS there, SRAS as I've drawn them, why would you, there's nothing in what I just said that would suggest that they have to be anywhere near potential, right? Why would you expect the blue and the red lines to cross anywhere near the vicinity of the green line? Is there some inexorable force that pulls that intersection towards the green line? It seems like there should be if you just think about all the graphs I've shown you, right? The short-run equilibria, while they are, right, not on the orange line on the top graph, they seem to be close, right? And whenever they go below, they seem to come back. Whenever they go above, they seem to also come back. So what is that all about, right? How does that work? So, by the way, before I think about that, maybe I'll just tell you that we have the recessionary gap where they cross below, the inflationary gap they cross above. So this would be kind of the economy. People are just really happy about the future. Businesses are irrationally exuberant. Everybody's spending money, and aggregate demand goes way up, and now we're above potential. That's kind of what's going on here. We call that an inflationary gap. It's a little mysterious. I'll tell you why we call it that in a second. So GDP is near potential. I guess the question here is, why is it always around potential, right? Why would we expect that crossing line to be around the green line? Okay. Well, there's this thing that goes back, there's an old tradition in economics. And you might think about this as, you know by now that I like to talk about these things. There was an economist back in the day that Jean-Baptiste Say, who stated something, nowadays we say it a little bit differently, but had this idea that because of the circular flow, there was a natural tendency for the flow to regulate in such a way that it would achieve its potential or be near its potential. The way we often say this kind of in an off-the-cuff way is that supply creates its own demand, right? I might say it a little bit more in a more nuanced fashion, which would be to say that supply and demand, well, I should have thought about this, but I had it in my mind and then lost it. Supply and demand find a point at which they're both consistent, right? And how do they do this? Well, it's through the prices, and in particular, that price level that we've been talking about, right? I pushed to the side here. Wages, right? Remember, they're still lurking in the background here on my diagram. So I think it's easiest to just kind of show you how this works through an example and explain to you how the economy has this gravitational force that whenever there's an intersection away from this long-run aggregate supply, it's pulled back to the aggregate supply. So let's do it this way. There's a lot of great economics in this. So I'll have my aggregate supply here. I'll draw aggregate demand here. We'll suppose it's low. Maybe we're in the Great Depression or something. So output is now low. Unemployment is now high, right? It's higher than it should be. People are complaining about the economy. They're saying, oh man, it's terrible out there. I can't find a job. We're wandering the countryside looking for farm work of mice and men. Okay, so that's the macroeconomic backdrop. Now, if you're a worker in this world, right, you're out there looking for jobs, you're applying for jobs and all of that stuff. Maybe you walk into an employer and you say, hey, can you hire me? I need some work. And the employer says, you know what? I can't pay you at this. I can't pay you to do this job at that wage. It's too much. What might you do in that case if you're a little bit desperate? You might say, you know what? I don't need that job at that wage. Do you have a job where you can pay me a little bit less, right? Okay, I can hire you. As long as your wage or salary is a little bit lower than it otherwise would be. Good. Notice I said wage and lower in that. Now, if you think about this dynamic playing itself out throughout the whole economy, the fact that people are unemployed, right? This is unemployment here, higher than usual unemployment, means that what will happen is people will start taking jobs at lower wages than they would have otherwise, right? There's slack in the labor market. The unemployment tries to go away. How does it do so? By taking work at lower wages. But when wages change, right, we can't just have our same old supply and demand curve here. When wages start going down, well, that's important for supply, right? As wages go down, what do businesses do? Well, they're more interested in hiring people than they were before, right? And as that plays out, well, remember how painstakingly I excluded wages from the drawing of this diagram? Well, now if we have them changing, the only way we can show that is by shifting a curve, right? So what we would expect to have happen is here, there's downward pressure on wages, and so slowly or over time, we expect aggregate supply through this process to shift back to get us back to potential. Now here, once again, the unemployment, the unusual unemployment is gone. We're back at potential, right? So our investment crisis caused this, but then there was this adjustment in wages, the hidden prices on this diagram, that got us back, right? The natural adjustment process. There's the gravity that pulls our aggregate demand, aggregate supply in the short run back to the long run. Of course, maybe we can do this in reverse too. I'll just redraw the whole thing. Suppose I draw this Here's aggregate demand. Here's aggregate supply. Now I've drawn a different situation, right? So now aggregate demand and aggregate supply are above, right, equilibrium, or above the long run aggregate supply. So in this sense, what's happened is now, if you think about my diagram here, we're now at one of these points. See right where it says real GDP up there? We're at a point where our GDP is above potential, right? So why would this, that would be an inflationary gap. So why is this two questions now. Why is this called an inflationary gap might be one of them. And the other one might be, what's going on in the economy on the ground here? What's the employment situation? So when the economy is above potential, everybody has jobs, right? You go on LinkedIn, there's businesses are like, oh man, people are so happy and so excited to be spending money that we need to fire up the engines here and keep producing. We got to hire some people. They throw ads on LinkedIn. They want a new AI specialist for $60,000 a year. But they find that nobody's taking those ads, right? Because everybody's working. The economy's already going full steam ahead, right? So what would businesses do in this situation? Well, they'll say, you know what? 60,000, maybe we'll go to 75,000 a year, right? We'll pay a higher wage to attract the employees that we need. There's just none around because unemployment is so low, right? It's below its natural rate. And what happens as that goes on? Well, once again, now we're discussing the hidden price, the wage on this diagram. We're discussing it getting pulled up, right? So as this wage starts being bid up because of the tightness in the labor market, we would expect that the aggregate supply curve starts shifting out like this, right? And of course, this ends once we get back to potential. So in some sense, you can kind of, you'll hear economists say things like, well, the cure for the other thing I didn't say here is as we were moving back to potential from below in our recessionary gap, prices were in general falling, right? So that kind of suggests to us why prices seem to go down in a recession, right, as we come out of it. And economists will often say things like that. The cure for a recession is deflation. The cure for, the economy being above potential is inflation, right? So that's kind of, you see the general price level going up as wages go up here, right? One reason why I think I'm unique in my Eco 100 class and that I make sure to get you to this point and do macroeconomics is because I think this is just such a wonderful diagram and a wonderful way of thinking about how the macroeconomy works in general here. So we kind of talk about it here, and maybe just to say once again here, here's a very simplified picture. We have a situation where demand maybe jumps up because people are really excited about the future. They're exuberant. There's some big increase in spending. Aggregate demand shifts out so we were at point A, we now move to point B. Well, that's great, but at Q1 now, relative to QE, the potential, labor markets are so tight that businesses are having trouble finding workers at the existing wage. Wages go up, that shifts the supply back, we wind up at C. So there you have kind of this arc by which we start at potential, go above potential, and come back, right? We could do the recessionary gap too, and maybe now I can accentuate what I meant by deflation curing the gap. So AD1, we start off in the normal sequence of things. There's some sadness in investment markets, maybe because of the subprime crisis. People are uncertain about spending money and investing and all that stuff. So from aggregate one, we shift back to AD2, we find ourselves at Y1. Right, so now it's Y, and I shouldn't have changed that. The important thing here is this double arrow. That's now unemployment, right? unemployment means the labor markets are in slack, people are willing to work for lower wages, and as they accept lower wage jobs, we move from this point Y1, AP1 to here. Supply shifts out, prices fall, and we find ourselves back at potential. So that kind of explains to you how you can cycle around the long run trend in GDP. So my frenzied presentation did pretty well today, I think. But every time we seem to answer a question or fill in a gap, there's another one that follows on here, right? So policy is a big word in the macroeconomic circle. Policy, policy, policy. Let's cut taxes, let's do this, let's do that. I've just described for you how the economy kind of fluctuates on its own, right? Whenever a problem occurs, whenever we fall below potential or above potential, adjustments in wages, as I've called them, pull us back. So why do we need policy at all then? What does policy do here, right? Well, I'm going to show you how policy works. I guess I have a lecture to do this next class. But really the argument for it is that, these jagged lines are, they look great when you graph them on a giant projector screen and all that stuff. But if you think about the real aspects of this, what's going on beyond the scenes, they're pretty upsetting, right? Particularly those recessions. When I'm talking about people looking for jobs and all that stuff, it sucks to be unemployed, right? And it sucks to have to deal with chaos in labor markets and all of that stuff. It sucks to be wandering the countryside in the Great Depression looking for work, right? So Keynes was sensitive to this, and he said this process may just be too chaotic and it might take too long, right? To just hope for the best and let the economy work. So his famous the saying about all this was that in the long run, we are all dead, right? Meaning that as we wait around for stuff like this to happen, our lives just kind of go by. So if we can do something as policymakers that lets us avoid these fluctuations, great. What is it? How do we do it, right? And in this way, we can kind of get out of these situations, maybe more expediently and maybe in a way that helps us all. So to this end, we have a couple of different ways of doing this. We'll get to it next time. We can think about using government spending or taxation to influence aggregate demand. So that will get us back to potential when the economy goes below. We call that fiscal policy, taxing and spending. There's also monetary policy, right? This is usually what you think about the Federal Reserve is doing, right? Changing interest rates and things like that, again, to influence aggregate demand when it gets a little out of whack, when it goes too far above or too far below potential. And so we'll talk about that stuff next time. Man, we did good. Here's a fiscal policy slide to get you going there. Attendance. Let's do a quick attendance here while I'm babbling. I'm sorry I do this at the end, but it seems like this gives you some leeway. Right. So everything should be up on Top Hat now. All of the problem sets, all of the lecture notes, and also all of the readings. They should all be there. Question?
Are the reading questions graded?
They're participatory, so I just check to see if you've done them.
Okay.
But I'll have to say something about that next time as well. Make sure the policy is all cleaned up on that. You're talking about